Hi, and welcome to my demonstration on watercoloring a Bohemian Waxwing. I start off with my pencil sketch, and to lighten up the lines once I'm done drawing, I roll a kneaded eraser over the entire drawing. My second step is to come up with my color palette. For my bird paintings, I do try to do color matching to the subject. Colors are an important part of bird identification, and I enjoy the challenge of trying to make the colors look as realistic as possible. For the Bohemian Waxwing, I am using transparent pyrrole orange and Hansa yellow light. That third swatch is a mix of the two together. I'm also going to use manganese blue hue and burnt sienna. I add indigo for my darks and create a few swatches of indigo and burnt sienna mixed together at different water to paint ratios. Lastly, I will add quinacridone gold. Once I'm happy with my color choices, I make sure to write down the names, and then I'm ready to begin painting. This color palette is made up of the colors I see in the bird. I don't plan on painting a background, but even if I were, I would just use these colors in it to make sure that I have color harmony. I prefer to paint most of my bird paintings and botanical paintings on just a white paper background. I start off looking for the lightest areas in my subject. And to paint light areas in watercolor, our mix has to be fairly watery. You can see from the paint in my palette that I am painting at a weak tea consistency. For these colors, I am using mostly a watered down burnt sienna with a touch of indigo in it. Once in a while, I will push this mix more towards the indigo, like in this area I'm painting right now, or more towards burnt sienna for the redder hues. I also touch just a little bit of transparent pyrrole orange into this in certain sections. My eye is always going back and forth between my painting and my reference photo. By focusing on these lightest areas first, I feel like I'm warming up. I'm less likely to make a mistake of going too dark too soon. And maybe for me, this is a gentler way to step into the watercolor process when I'm starting a new painting. I will work my way around his body, looking for all the lightest hues and painting them in. I notice that on that left-hand shoulder, it's definitely a little bit darker. So while the area I have painted is still damp, I drop in some thicker, transparent pyrrole orange. I love the softness that is created by dropping wet paint into a wet area. As I work over to the right area of the bird's body, I see that it shifts from transparent pyrrole orange to more of a sienna tone. I decide to brighten up the upper part of the breast with a little quinacridone gold. I know that when it first goes down, it looks very bright, but I am painting into a damp area, so this color will fade quite a bit as it dries. Before the shape I've already painted has a chance to dry, I'm looking for what other colors I need to add in so that they can blend softly. Oftentimes, when we add color to an area that's still wet or damp, we get what is called cauliflowers or blossoms. This happens when the mixture of water to paint on your brush is more watery than the water to paint in your painting. You run a danger of creating these blossoms where you may not want them. If you're painting with a really watery mix and the shape you're dropping the paint into has started to dry. In other words, you want to keep your puddle about as wet as the shape you're painting into. While the bird's body is starting to dry, I skip the branch and I come down to paint in his tail. I'm using transparent pyrrole orange with just a touch of burnt sienna on the tip where the tail is darker. On the right hand side, the tail is slightly lighter, so I just touch what I've already painted with a damp brush. You can see that I clean out my brush often as I switch colors. What you can't see on camera is that I also have a towel in my left hand and I'm constantly tapping the excess water in the brush on that towel to dry it out a little bit. Now I'm using manganese blue hue, really watered down, to create the highlight in the eye. Instead of just trying to paint a small little highlight, I paint the entire shape of the eye and I paint the entire shape of the beak. Once those have dried, I will come back and paint the darker shapes around it. My first layer of paint on the bird's body has dried, so now I'm coming in and painting a second layer. This might be a good stage to explain the ugly duckling scenario. All paintings tend to go through an ugly duckling stage, where you're just not sure if it's coming together. Things seem disjointed, colors might seem off. I find that a lot of students quit at this stage. They just think it's not going to work and they quit too soon. An accomplished painter has just done enough paintings to have a sense of trust in the process. You learn to trust that just by moving forward, it will start improving again. Don't be too quick to declare a painting a failure. You really do need to just put in the time and create a lot of failures to get to the good stuff, while also remembering that all paintings go through an ugly duckling stage. I've started painting in the branches. I love the branches in our reference image. It was one of the reasons I was attracted to this photo. There's something calligraphic about these branches and it adds another element of interest. To paint them, I'm using burnt sienna and indigo at various water to paint ratios for light and dark, but I also add in a little bit of manganese blue. I love these three colors together and use them often for any kind of branch or twig in a painting. If I used a smaller brush, I could get thin lines, but I would also be running out of paint a lot as I work my way through the branch. And every time I come back to the palette to reload the brush, I would have to stop and start that branch again. It can look disjointed really quickly. So instead I'm using a number 2 black gold 311 brush. It's fairly big for this kind of a subject, but I'm just using the tip of it and not putting very much pressure. So as you can see, I can get some pretty thin lines. I'm making the branch much darker underneath the bird, as he would probably be casting a shadow on it. Before painting the dark branch, it's possible to have looked at the bird that I was painting and think that it was way too dark. But that really is just an illusion because all we had was the white of the paper to compare it against. Now that I have a dark branch in, the bird has started to look much lighter again. As I paint the top of the bird's head, I'm using transparent pyrrole orange and just a touch of burnt sienna in the areas that are darker. I'm paying careful attention and going pretty slowly in this area because the contour of the bird is important. Now I'm picking up a much smaller brush. I want to start doing a few little detailed marks, like the feathery little marks that come off of the crown at the back of the head. I also will use the smaller brush to do the details of the eye, the beak, and the feet. I want to be sure to keep those in proportion. I prepare to paint the beak with indigo at a thick consistency. These dark markings on the Bohemian Waxwing are really dark, and I don't want to paint this with a watery indigo, which would just require me to go in and do several layers. Every time I repaint a shape with another layer, I can end up misshaping it. So I'm painting very thick and with a very small brush, paying careful attention to the photo as I go back and forth between my reference image and my painting. With a watered down bit of indigo, I'm painting the ring around the eye. Then I'm going back to the black tip of the beak. Notice that I turned the paper around to better access any area that I want to paint. While I wait for those areas to dry, I go in and start painting some of the darker branches. You can see I'm using the small brush for this, but that's because this is just a little twiggy area that can have a lot of disjointed parts. Paint with whatever size brush you're comfortable with, and maybe for these particular shapes, practice in a sketchbook first. To keep the branch interesting, I also keep using different colors. I have a puddle of indigo, I have a puddle of burnt sienna, and manganese blue. Sometimes I add more water, sometimes I add more paint. If you mix a puddle and just keep painting this entire branch from that puddle, it will lose interest and will also look very flat. By painting with different values and different colors, it creates a three-dimensional look and is also visually interesting. With the branch done, I turn my attention back to the bird. I want to get that yellow that's on the tip of his tail painted in. I'm using Hansa Yellow Light. It's a good match for this part of the bird, although there are a few little areas that show a little bit of different color, a little bit darker. So after I get my yellow painted in at a milky consistency, I will come in and just touch a little bit of burnt sienna in one or two spots. And I soften it with a damp brush. I want to continue working on this part of the tail, but that yellow is damp, so I turn the paper around so that I'm not going to put my hand in it by mistake as I paint the other areas. I've learned this lesson the hard way. With watered down indigo and just a touch of sienna, I start painting in the tip of the wing. While this area is still damp, I will touch it with just a little bit of thicker indigo paint. And then I start painting the wing area right above. Because the dark wing is very distinct from the lighter body, I made sure that the body is completely dry before I start painting in this dark paint next to it. I'm painting at a pretty thick consistency on dry paper next to a dry shape. This ensures that these distinct bodies have a hard edge between them. I take a minute to figure out what I should paint next. I decide it's going to be the very dark throat of my Bohemian Waxwing. So with indigo at a pretty creamy consistency, I come in and get that dark shape painted in. Now he's finally beginning to look like himself. I get my small brush to create some of those feathery markings. Still with the small brush, I come in and start detailing the beak. I'm still using thick indigo paint with just a touch of burnt sienna in it. And as I start painting around the eye, I really do pay careful attention to the shape of the eye. My image is on my computer, so when I start doing things like eyes and beaks, I enlarge the image to really see the shapes, the highlights, the ring around the eye, and really pay attention to the shape of the beak as well. As I paint in the darkest areas of the eye, I pay careful attention to preserve the highlight. Within this wing, there are a few areas that are not dark. They show us the layers of different feathers. I left those as white of the paper, and now I'm going in with some burnt sienna and touching them up. It's time to let everything in this area dry, so I'll flip the painting back around and figure out what to paint next. It's time to do those feet. First, I paint the entire foot with the lightest shade I see in the foot. I don't want to add a lot of details to this area, but I do want to make it interesting and at least give the impression and the suggestion of the texture of these feet. While that light paint is still damp, I add a little bit of dark indigo at a milky consistency. For the other foot, I do the light layer with just a little bit of watered down indigo. While I wait for that to dry just a little bit, I pay attention to the orange part of the tail. I'm mixing some transparent pyrrole orange with some burnt sienna that was already on my palette. And I start feathering in some markings where the orange part of the tail is up against the white. The color needs to be more saturated on the tail, so I give it another layer of transparent pyrrole orange at a milky consistency. Working in layers is a great way to help you bump up your colors and your values in slow, more manageable and controllable steps. Working in layers means painting one layer on top of an area that has already dried. Once I've darkened the tail, I decide I need to darken the crown to match. And now it's time to finish the detailing on the eye. It's time to put in the second wing. I start with some of the lighter shapes that I see in the wing. With burnt sienna and indigo. Burnt sienna and indigo are just beautiful colors to mix together for all shades of gray. Depending on how warm or cool your gray is, you can just play with the ratio of burnt sienna to indigo. Here I'm using a slightly damp brush to lift out some of the indigo from this wing. Once I've lifted out some of that indigo, it looks a little bit more layered and textured. I drop in a bit of burnt sienna. And I want to clean that edge. So with a good amount of paint on my brush, not too watery, I come in and sharpen up the edge. Now that the orange and yellow shapes in the tail are dry, I can finish painting it with the watery gray. While that gray shape is still damp, I add a little bit thicker indigo right along the edge of it so that there's a nice soft blend. Time to paint in that second wing. This is mostly indigo at a milky to creamy consistency. And using just the tip of this brush, I'm trying to capture the shapes that I see with the divisions of different feathers in the folded wing. I'm starting to look for details now, and that always tells me I'm getting close to the end of the painting. There is just a little triangular negative shape beneath the foot that is the black wing behind it, so I'm sure to get that in. And then I start looking at other areas that need just a little bit of crisping up along the edges. For me, I found that the paintings I enjoy the most are the ones that have a good balance between a few detailed areas and a few loose, even abstract areas. This balance is different for everybody. In my bird paintings, I really enjoy detailing the eye, and then perhaps the beak and a few other feathery areas. I also then look for areas where I can just have wet into wet washes and a softer, looser approach. You'll find what you prefer the more paintings you get done. Each painting teaches us how to paint and also teaches us about our own preferences. Here I'm going back to that second foot and starting to add the darker shapes. At first they are dry marks that capture the texture in the foot. Then I will come in and loosen those up. Our eye is attracted to hard edges, and if I put a lot of hard edge information in the feet area, they become too important. At this point, I'm looking at my painting and comparing it to the reference picture and trying to figure out what areas might need to be darkened up just a little bit. As shapes dry, they tend to fade, and sometimes that works out well, and sometimes we need to go in and do a second layer. So that is what I am assessing at this point. Now I'm going in and softening some of those details I painted on the feet. I've learned not to rush myself to the finish. Instead, I take time to let things dry, I take a break, and I come back and assess. Now my painting is dry, and I see a few areas that I want to darken up a little bit, in particular on the left-hand side of the bird. I'd like to make that edge a little bit darker. Since he is dry, if I just paint in that outline and leave it like that, it will look like a hard edge outline. So after painting it in with transparent pyrrole orange, I come in with a damp brush and just soften that area. It creates a nice soft transition from the dark edge to the lighter parts of the bird. As I continue to soften the bird's orangey throat, I decide to also add a little bit of burnt sienna to the breast, giving it more color. This is a watery consistency and a very small value shift. Working in watery layers like this gives you great control over both color and value. As I've darkened his head and chest, I decide to darken the wing again. I'm using my small brush and thick paint to really give myself some crisp edges on that wing. I do the same with the other wing and give my bird one last look. A few touches and I'm done. I hope you've enjoyed this demonstration of my watercolor of a Bohemian waxwing. Thank you to Makul Soman, who gave me permission to use his photograph for this painting.